Hi, I'm Bob Bazenko, professor of history and co-host of the Green and Red podcast. Today, I want to talk about the era of U.S. economic globalization from the end of World War II onward. On November 30th, we'll all commemorate and celebrate the 25th anniversary of the shutdown of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, meeting in Seattle, the so-called Battle of Seattle. And we're going to have a series of interviews with people who were active in organizing the protests. We'll talk to them about how they planned for the demonstrations and what they think the aftermath of it was. Uh, but before we begin that part of the series, I want to give here a brief description of the global economy that became the object of those protests on November 30th, 1999. And to be sure, there were plenty of protests before that and even more after that. I'll talk about the measures the United States took at the end of the Second World War and the outset of the Cold War to establish global hegemony and economic imperialism, such as the Bretton Woods System, which includes the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, international agreements on trade, various economic developments, and transitions in the period of Vietnam, and then the move toward transnational organizations like especially NAFTA and the WTO, which not only created a new world economic order, but also unleashed a new era of deindustrialization, precarity, and diminished standards of living in the US and significantly changed and actually realigned American politics. But to begin, I want to start in the early 20th century. Policymakers in the US, especially President Woodrow Wilson, wanted to create a new world order, and especially at the end of the Great War during the peace conference at Versailles and afterward. And they wanted to create a new world economy along liberal, capitalist, internationalist lines, and to establish political influence in the established world and hegemony over the less developed areas. The overriding goal, manifested in the creation of institutions like the IMF and World Bank, was to cultivate a worldwide system of free trade, an open door, which will be trade and investment without state subsidies, tariffs that would become burdensome, or other barriers. In such a system, the United States would naturally receive the lion's share of benefits because it had the most vigorous and productive economy, had actually come out of the war stronger, and had global economic visions and connections, right? However, there was a persistent risk by the 1940s that the world could revert to the competitive and economically nationalist measures that were so evident in the interwar period when the Germans and Japanese tried to close off entire regions to outside commerce to create autarkies, which would exclude the US and other countries from trade and investment from their markets. In 1944, when Dean Acheson, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State, testified before a special congressional committee talking about post-war economic policy, he explained what was going to happen going forward. He said, we cannot go through another 10 years, he's referring to the Depression of the 20s and 30s, we cannot go through another 10 years without having the most far-reaching consequences upon our economic and social systems. My contention is that we cannot have full employment and prosperity in the United States without the foreign markets. And so economic expansion coupled with military power are going to be the modus operandi of the United States going forward. Um, Dean Acheson continued. He said the nation's greatest economic challenge was finding markets, not increasing production. The United States has unlimited creative energy. The important thing is markets, Acheson said. Moreover, markets were essential not just for economic progress, but were required to maintain America's political structures, right? The United States might be able to develop a rigid state economy with all the production and consumption done at home under government controls, which would be an autarkic system like National Socialist Germany. Acheson speculated on this, but he said such an economically nationalist system would betray America's constitutional principles and undermine its concepts of property and liberty. Without foreign markets, Acheson went on, the United States would face economic distress and political crisis. A global open door was thus essential to developing America's economic power and maintaining the political system as well. So the stakes were very quite big in 1945. The United States would use its strength to expand the open door and had inherent advantages because it produced so much more than other economies. It would also use military power to coerce nations that did not have the same reverence for the open door that Atchison and his associates did. And there was obviously a huge laundry list of various countries the United States pressured or overthrew or subverted or whatever in order to develop kind of economic partnerships, unequal economic partnerships, to be sure. In the process, the United States would expand its concept of national interests to all over the globe, propel forward an immense arms race, violate the sovereignty of other lands, and undermine democracy and freedom, both abroad and at home. And a key element in all this is the development of the so-called Bretton Woods system. It's really kind of the cornerstone of America's strategy for hegemony coming out of World War II. But while the war itself was still being waged, the British goal, while the war itself was still being waged, the United States, the British, and the Soviet Union were allies, but they all had different interests. The British want to maintain their empire. The Soviet Union wanted to establish a defensive barrier in Eastern Europe against Germany or others, and also to have economic power with the countries of Eastern Europe that it occupied. And America's goals were obviously much broader and more ambitious to create a new global economic order with the United States in the lead based on these ideas of a worldwide open door and based on private enterprise, which is really crucial to all this, and free trade. And they saw that as a way to thwart what they perceived as outdated European type imperialism and to prevent the expansion, obviously, of Soviet or other kinds of left influences. And the United States could do this by using its economic strength to, promote and assert its power in the post-war era. In July of 1944, then, political and economic officials from the U.S. and 43 other developed countries met in New Hampshire at Bretton Woods to convene what became officially known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. These people were the kind of ruling class of the globe. They understood that World War II, although it was still raging, was going to end with an Allied victory over Germany and Japan. So they wanted to create a post-war system that would stabilize the global economy so there would be no repeat of the global depressions of the 1920s and 30s that had led to the Second World War. And they also hoped to establish a world based on free trade and markets to both eliminate colonialism and to avoid the types of conflicts that had occurred when Germany and Japan had tried to close off those large regions of the world to outside commerce. The Secretary of State during the New Deal, during much of the New Deal, Cardinal Hull was a firm proponent of free trade as an instrument for global stability and believed that countries which traded together were not going to go to war against each other as well, right? So for some time prior to 1944, American officials had been determined to do this, to create this new global economic and financial system to give it, the United States, free access to markets and resources and labor and investment and so forth. At Bretton Woods, therefore, Americans were able to exploit their power as the only major nation that had improved its standing as a result of World War II. They were not devastated by World War II, unlike pretty much all the other major combatants were. So at Bretton Woods, the United States and other central bankers and political leaders established two institutions, which are still around today, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. The World Bank was officially known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. These bodies are still around. They remain as important and controversial today as when they were founded. They kind of became the underpinning of America's economic power, just as the United Nations would consolidate America's political power, U.S. political power. At Bretton Woods, the kind of brains of the operation were John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist and an American, Harry Dexter White. It was a conference to design a liberal economic order to avoid what had happened in the 1920s. So the U.S. and Western countries, along with all these others, created the IMF and World Bank. These people at Bretton Woods, these designers of this Bretton Woods system, tried to create or hoped to create a stable global economic order based on free trade. They wanted international monetary cooperation with international agencies, defining what the global economy would look like and who would dominate these agencies, who would put the most money in, who would have the most votes, who would have the most influence. Well, what do you think when it comes to those questions of who would get more, who would get the most? It was obviously Washington, D.C. would. And because the Americans had such a predominant role in any kind of post-war planning because of their power and their strength and the relative lack of damage done to the U.S. during the war, right? The U.S. Depression actually ended as a result of military production during World War II. So at Bretton Woods, this kind of recognizes all of these things. The IMF's particular purpose, the International Monetary Fund's particular purpose, was to stabilize world currencies. In the 1930s, before the war broke out, one of the major reasons for the depression, for all kinds of other economic problems, was that currencies had depreciated and fluctuated wildly because so many of these countries were carrying over huge debts from World War I. In addition to that, global trade had gone down terribly. By 1933, global trade was less than one-third of what it had been in 1929. It had gone from about $3 billion in 1929 to under 900 million in 1933. Because of that, exchange rates were fluctuating constantly. Trade was diminished. And now, with currency fluctuations occurring on a regular basis, trade was becoming even more difficult. So the Bretton Woods designers wanted to change that. They wanted to avoid that. So they funded the IMF at $7.3 billion, which is a significant amount of money in the mid 1940s. The IMF was a lending institution. If a country had a huge balance of payments deficit, meaning that the money leaving that country in the form of military spending or tourism or investment is too big, that it exceeds what's brought in. If they have that kind of a balance payments deficit, they could go to the IMF and say, we have a massive balance of payments deficit, and that's affecting our home economy. Can you loan us some money? So if your currency is in crisis, there's a wild run on your currency or something like that, you go to the IMF. And this has happened a lot, especially like in the 1990s with the ruble, the peso, and the Thai baht, all kind of around the same period, right? So it's not an uncommon development. When a national, privately based economy needed help, and that's important, it's got to be a privately based, a capitalist economy needed help. The IMF can say, yeah, we can loan you money and we can stabilize your currency. And this generally involves a massive infusion of cash. So you don't have to devalue your own currency and you don't terribly expand your balance of payments and you don't have to go to outside banks. So the IMF's goal is to avert economic crisis with massive infusions of cash. If a country finds itself in a currency crisis or unable to pay its debts or control its currencies, then it can go to the IMF and say, hey, we need loans, we need help, we're in trouble. This is crucial because if you have stable currencies, then you can do the most important thing, which is to engage in commerce, to trade. And this is kind of the underpinning of all this stuff. Stable currencies led to better trade. You can promote exchange stability and convertibility and therefore facilitate trade. It sounds redundant, but that's how important it is. This isn't a handout. This isn't charity work, but the World Bank is pretty important as well. So let me talk about that also. And they both kind of operate the same way, which we'll mention at the end, right? The second institution created at Bretton Woods was the World Bank. It made funds available to all the countries that had been wiped out in Europe, but also to what we would maybe call third world or less developed countries as well. The World Bank's goals were to establish industry. At the time, this was often referred to as modernization. So the goals of the bank were to establish these new societies and to quote from them, to promote private investment. And that's really a crucial part of all this. These are really counterparts to global capitalist expansion. To promote the long-range balanced growth of international trade, the World Bank had really significant meaning. The stated goals in the World Bank Charter were to promote private investment, to promote long-range balanced growth of international trade. The World Bank was capitalized at $9.1 billion over which a third was funded by the Americans, and it was authorized to lend it at twice that amount. So again, it's a fairly significant lending agency like the IMF. In addition, the World Bank always has an American as its president. So it's fairly easy at this point to see what the American interest is in a larger globalizing sense. It's trying to create economic stability that's good for the US in terms of kind of carving out a global economic open door that will benefit American businesses and American bankers and so forth. But it's even more specific than that. It's also a way to help your friends and hurt your enemies. Support from either institution, whether it be an IMF loan or a World Bank development loan, are conditioned upon the requirement that aid be channeled through certain institutions. Through whom? Mostly U.S. businesses. With state support, these institutions, like the IMF and World Bank, essentially help to provide contracts for private companies. If you have a state-run communication system or a state-run banking system or a state-run transportation system, then what are the IMF or the World Bank going to do? They're going to tell you to privatize. If you go through private corporations and not states, then American corporations have access to markets and resources. And isn't that vital if you're trying to avoid what had happened after World War One in the minds of Atchison and Keynes and White and so many others? So if a nation seeks aid from the IMF or from the World Bank, it has to work with American banks, with American reconstruction companies, with American industries, and so forth, thereby guaranteeing American economic activity, American profits. If you want the World Bank to build a telecommunications system or something like that, it can't be state run. It's not going to be state run. As part of the deal, you have to engage private companies, the Brown and Roots of the world, or the Halliburtons of the world after that, or the AT&Ts of the world, or the banks of the world, or the U.S. Steels and Corporations of the world, or the GEs of the world, or whoever, right? So you get the point. These loans are given out with the caveat that those states which receive those loans will purchase goods and services back from American and other suppliers. So it's a way to kind of safeguard American businesses to make sure they continue to have economic activity, unlike the crisis that had happened in the 1920s. So it's a way to guarantee markets and investment for American companies. In the same way, if a country doesn't have that type of an open economic, private economic system, then what happens to them? Do they get access to the World Bank and the IMF? No, they don't. So let's say a country has a balance of payments or a currency stabilization crisis, out of control inflation or something like that. They go to the IMF and they say, we need money. We need an infusion of cash. The IMF doesn't simply say, okay, write out a check and hand it to them. It says first this has to go through private channels, which I just mentioned, right? But more than that, it says you have to engage in certain practices. If the IMF or the World Bank is going to give you this kind of money, you have to change your economy. For one thing, you have to start getting cash. How do you get cash? Exports, exports, exports. All right. So the first thing the IMF is going to tell you is you need to develop a more export-oriented economy and cut, usually significantly, public spending on things like education and communications and public health and so forth. So another kind of more contemporary example, this would be in the 1990s, how these institutions, through what were called structural adjustment programs, forced Indonesia to heavily cut lumber and export it to get export earnings to get cash, which of course kind of decimated the lumber industry as well. In addition to these kinds of requirements, the nations at Bretton Woods, Bretton Woods also created a new world currency system. And again, to America's benefit, they created a gold standard with the American dollar as a universal and convertible currency. So if any nation possessed gold, it could trade that gold based on a par value of 35 US dollars for an ounce of gold. All trade could then therefore be conducted in dollars, and the US would accept gold in payments and pay out dollars to any country. So America's currency absolutely dominates the world, which is why today, when people talk about de-dollarization, there's kind of an air of anxiety, if not panic, about it. At Bretton Woods, the dollar was established, and even though, as we'll mention in a minute, the Bretton Woods system kind of ended, and a little over 25 years later, the dollar remains as the globe's most important currency. But in that period, in the Bretton Woods system, then created this mechanism for post-war economic power, which is why I think it's important and warrants some discussion. By subsidizing currency stabilization and reconstruction and development, channeling it through American companies, American corporations and banks and so forth, and making the dollar the world's currency, which was fully convertible to gold. American representatives had made sure that the world's commerce would be free, so to speak, and meaning that it would be accessible to American companies and their subsidiaries and not open to competing systems. The Soviet Union, for instance, did have representatives at Bretton Woods, but did not join the IMF or the World Bank because the Soviet Union obviously had a stage managed economy and did not want to reveal its economic data. And it also, of course, rejected the requirement for private enterprise, which they believed would ensure American domination of the global economy. And in the ensuing decades, America's economic strength soared and created the greatest economic prosperity for some that the world had ever witnessed. It would also, however, cause grave political and social problems because of the inequalities that the global economic order spawned and gave rise to political conflicts as well. And parties left behind would normally see these institutions as the cause of their own poverty and distress, institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, right? Also, around this time, as part of this globalizing mission, the United States also organized in 1948 the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was a legal agreement between many countries to promote international trade by reducing things like tariffs and quotas and other barriers, which is kind of a part of this mission for the open door for free trade that you saw already in the IMF and World Bank. The GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, purpose was a substantial reduction of tariffs and trade barriers, and it went into effect provisionally in January of 1948 and remained in effect until 1995 when the WTO was established and replaced. And generally, tariffs remained fairly low. They dropped and remained fairly low throughout the GATT years. With this early flurry of economic reordering of the world economy, the U.S. path toward greater power was well established. And by 1948, the very famous American diplomat, George Kennan, was very candid in describing America's mission going forward. Kennan said, "We have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships that will allow us to maintain this position of disparity." And those are the key words there, to maintain this position of disparity. So going forward, the U.S. had devised its strategy for global economic hegemony that would broaden that gap between American economic interest and everybody else's to maintain that position of disparity. And that would continue for some time, really. It still is today, actually. But it would start to see a shift in the global economy in the 1970s. The Bretton Woods system and subsequent agreements, as I said, meant that foreign currencies could be converted to gold. But by the 1960s, that system started to fray quite badly by the end of that decade. Shifts in the global economy, the beginnings of the rise of less developed countries, economies, movements of Western companies abroad to open up factories at lower wages and so forth, but especially the Vietnam War, led to a gold crisis in 1967 and 1968. More countries began to cash in their US dollars for gold, and thereby leading to a run on gold. The United States didn't have enough gold to cover the volume of dollars circulating throughout the world, which led to an overvaluation of the dollar. Both John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson attempted to deal with this, but their efforts weren't terribly successful. Businesses involved in global trade were quite anxious that the dollar could be devalued, and so they began unloading their dollars even more too, which led to this major crisis between November 1967, when Britain devalued the pound, and between March of 1978, which coincided with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and an American request for 200,000 more troops and reservists, which was ultimately turned down because they couldn't afford it. And all of that threatened to bring down the global post-war economic era. By 1979, 71, I'm sorry, after several runs on the dollar, Richard Nixon sought a new economic course, and therefore we got what we now call the Nixon shock. Uh, Nixon, in August of 1915, said that it was time to turn America's attention toward events at home, the situation at home, rather than just Vietnam. He wanted to lower unemployment. He wanted to lower inflation. But kind of in the long range, the most important element of this was protecting the dollar from international money speculators. And he did that by essentially gutting the Bretton Woods Agreement on gold and convertibility. Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. He ended, the gold standard in American currency policy. Um, the United States, this was a popular view. Globally, not so much. It wasn't terribly successful. Uh, Beginning in 1973, the US dollar did have to devalue and undergo a series of exchange parities. In 1973, Europeans decided to connect their economies together and float them against the dollar. So this is a real period of economic crisis. It also coincides with the first oil shocks of 1973, right? So it brought an end to that fixed exchange rate system at Bretton Woods. This dollar gold crisis in the 60s, leaching into the 70s, didn't signify the end of America's global economic strength, but it did mean that the global economy would be structured differently going forward after the Vietnam War and the first oil shock in 1973. The American economy began to slow down. As this was happening, American companies began to invest in new resources and plant abroad. And by the later 1970s, the industry was shutting down facilities to seek cheaper labor and less difficult environmental regulations elsewhere. Uh, Places like Youngstown, Ohio, or Pittsburgh, or Gary, Indiana, or Detroit were really hit hard as they saw plants and jobs move first to other southern states because of lower wages, less union work, and fewer environmental regulations, and then eventually to places like Mexico, the maquiladoras, and to Asia, along with the rise of new economic powers, particularly China and later India and the so-called little tiger economies and so forth. A move toward economic integration in economic areas led to a notable shift, too, in the way that global trade and investment was organized. There had already been examples of this in the 1950s when the European Economic Community was established to increase economic cooperation among its member states. The EEC wanted to increase trade and economic growth by creating a common market. And it established common prices for agricultural products and removed internal tariffs and so forth. And by 1993, the EEC was incorporated into the European Union, which was renamed the European Community. And it basically was absorbed into other European institutions. And these regional, supranational organizations began to reflect the new economy. Countries in the same geographical area cooperated to develop economic policies and programs collectively to create a bigger economy and to be able to regulate and safeguard it against outside competition. And that led to NAFTA and the WTO, the precursors to today's economic turbulence in the world and the current divisive discussion of tariffs. The Battle of Seattle followed the passages of NAFTA and the WTO. NAFTA passed Congress in 1993, and then it went into effect on January 1st, 1994, which obviously not coincidentally was the day of the EZLN uprising in Chiapas. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was inspired by what the Europeans had done with the European Economic Community in eliminating tariffs in the hopes of stimulating trade against its members. Proponents wanted to establish a free trade area in North America to bring prosperity through increased trade and production. And they claimed it would create a huge number of jobs in all of the participating countries. NAFTA was ratified and went into effect, like I said, in 1994. NAFTA's main provisions called for the gradual reduction of tariffs and custom duties and other trade barriers between its three members, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The agreement ensured that eventually all access to a vast range of manufactured goods and commodities traded between the three countries would be duty-free. National goods status was provided to products imported from other NAFTA countries. And importantly, NAFTA banned any state or local or provisional government from imposing taxes or tariffs on such goods. So they're taking power away from local political bodies to create this supranational organization, NAFTA. Other provisions created formal rules for resolving disputes between investors and participating countries. And these rules permitted corporations or individual investors to sue for compensation any country that violated the rules of the treaty. There was a very famous case, I believe, in the 90s, where a Canadian company wanted to sell a product in California, but that product contained an additive, I believe it was a gasoline product, that had been banned in California as potentially carcinogenic. And the lawyers for this Canadian company did not file a suit in the state of California. They didn't have anything to do with the state of California. They filed a suit in a WTO, I'm sorry, in a NAFTA court. It may have been a WTO court, which operate the same way. I believe it was in a NAFTA court, actually. But they filed a lawsuit there saying that what California was doing by banning this particular additive because it was carcinogenic constituted a restraint of trade. And in this particular case, the purpose of these courts, whether they be NAFTA courts or WTO courts, is to defend the interests of the corporation. So in this particular case, the Canadian company won. And there are all kinds of examples like that. There were also smaller kind of side agreements for NAFTA, which somewhat address concerns over labor and environmental impacts of the treaty. But in general, obviously, the banks and the corporations and people who represented these ruling class interests were given, obviously, the vast amount of attention. And in addition to that, NAFTA gave these countries more access to markets in all kinds of industries, non-productive industries like banking and insurance and telecommunications and so forth. NAFTA was immediately controversial and unpopular. Like I said, in Chiapas, EZLN uprising started as a response to NAFTA. A lot of people criticized NAFTA. They believed it was this like kind of multinational corporation giveaway, giving all this power and new rights to these corporations to increase their profits at the expense of the ordinary people who needed wages to live. There was a critique that said that the overarching rules of NAFTA would damage American democracy by preventing them from issuing laws or regulations to protect the interest of their citizens, like the California case I just mentioned. And critics said that would probably bring around a huge degradation in environmental and health standards, right? Because now corporations could go to NAFTA courts or WTO courts to claim that environmental regulations were restraint of trade. They promoted privatization, of course. This is kind of seen at on with all these. You have to have private economic interests. The U.S. won't operate with like socialists as it sees it, right? And it would lead to the deregulation of key public services, much like the structural adjustment programs in the WTO would do. And it had a huge impact on agriculture, too. In Mexico, corn farmers and tomato farmers were en masse driven off the land after NAFTA because American corporations could go down there and purchase land and kind of dominate those industries. And the pass of NAFTA is huge. It's kind of one of the reasons why the Battle of Seattle, in retrospect, is so important, because the impact of NAFTA and WTO and globalization is really significant. It is one of the more consequential events that we've had in the 21st century now, late 20th, early 21st century. Between the late 90s and 2020, over 90,000 American factories closed down. I mean, not just because of NAFTA, but NAFTA had a huge role to play in that. And it's especially damaged a lot of these industrial places that I mentioned before, like Youngstown and Pittsburgh and so forth, right? And presidential elections, it's had a huge impact. In 2016, Trump's people understood what NAFTA had meant in places like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and actually spent a lot of time there attacking the Clinton record and the Democratic record on trade, right? And Trump called NAFTA the worst trade deal ever, and so forth. The NAFTA was owned by the Democratic Party. It was a Clinton and to some extent Obama deal. Obama was full on into globalization as well. It was actually trying to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership passed toward the end of his administration, right? But politically, it was really a damaging development for the Democratic Party. Trump won in 2016 about two-thirds of the votes uh, from people who believe that NAFTA and other free trade agreements took away American jobs. He won Ohio after Barack Obama had won it twice in 08 and 12. In other places, the impact of NAFTA was huge. Milwaukee had been known as the machine shop of the world. In the 1950s, about 60% of the adults in Milwaukee worked in manufacturing, and many of them had well-paying union jobs. And unionization obviously gets crushed as well in this period. In 1969, Milwaukee actually had the second highest median income in the country. By 1921, Milwaukee had lost more than 80% of its manufacturing jobs. Only about 5% that remained were unionized. It had the second highest poverty rate of any big American city. And again, you can look at other cities like this, and you'll see the impact that NAFTA had on labor and uh, basically just the daily lives of the people who used to work in those areas. Deindustrialization diminished the wealth and the power and the standard of living and the educational levels and the health of working class Americans as much as any development has really in the past 30 or 40 years. If you go to a place like again, Youngstown or Pittsburgh, people used to have fairly decent and stable middle class lives, and that now is much, much harder. Deindustrialization obviously isn't just because of NAFTA. There are other causes. But in big cities like Milwaukee, huge numbers, a quarter or more of manufacturing jobs were wiped out really within around the first decade. And a central driver has been things like NAFTA and these other free trade agreements. According to the Economic Policy Institute, NAFTA has changed the way workers are paid as well, their wages. It used to be that workers who had like a high school diploma or a GED could get good factory jobs and be paid pretty well. After NAFTA and these other trade agreements, Americans without college degrees have lost nearly $2,000 a year in wages. And this is a group which has been gravitating toward Trump's critique as well, which isn't coincidental, right? And the loss of jobs in these areas. And this is what NAFTA does. It's not just about jobs. It creates all kinds of connected exigencies and crises for people there. There's a falling life expectancy. There are greater numbers of what are often called deaths of desperation, homicides and suicides and drug overdoses. College-educated Americans now live over 8 years longer than those who don't have a college degree. One of the authors of one of the studies that looked into this said, I would put that down to deindustrialization combined with the lack of any political voice. And the Democrats, as I said, owned NAFTA, but when attacked upon it, basically were silent. So weren't really able to create a response to it, leaving it to more localized and isolated groups of resistance. Amid this, the WTO was also established in the 90s, and that became the focus of the anti-globalization protest. And as part of these protests, a lot of people, and we'll talk to some of them going forward, planned for demonstrations against the institution during the planned September 1999 meeting scheduled for Seattle. And that's the basis for the series of shows we're moving forward to because of this important event. We think it's worthwhile. We think it has significant meaning now. We talked to some really great people who were part of it. And, hopefully you'll enjoy it and learn something from it. So thank you and enjoy our series on Battle of Seattle at 25.